It was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Pitch black. The middle of nowhere in the Soviet Ural Mountains. Inside a small tent, 9 hikers were sleeping. They were young, tough, and incredibly experienced. They had everything they needed to survive the night: stoves, heavy jackets, food, and axes. But something happened in the darkness of February 2nd, 1959. Something that terrified them so purely, so completely, that they didn't even use the door. Investigative files confirmed the tent was slashed from the inside. They ran out into the freezing storm. No shoes, no coats, just socks and underwear. They ran a mile down the mountain into the dense forest, towards their death. When searchers found them weeks later, the mystery didn't end. It began. Some died of hypothermia, but others? Their ribs were crushed with the force of a car crash, yet there were no external bruises. One hiker was missing her eyes. Another was missing his tongue. And the clothing on their bodies? It contained traces of radiation. For 65 years, the Soviet government kept the files classified. They blamed it on a compelling natural force. But today we open the case file. We retrace their final steps. And we confront the terrifying question: what really walked the mountains that night? Before they were victims, they were friends. To understand the horror of their death, you have to understand the brightness of their lives. It was January 1959. The Soviet Union was thawing after the Stalinist era. The space race was heating up. Optimism was in the air. Leading the group was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. He was a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Igor wasn't just a hiker, he was a prodigy. He built his own radio stoves. He designed his own camping gear. He was the kind of leader you would follow into hell, and sadly they did. Joining him were 8 others. 2 women, 7 men. Most were students or graduates from the same institute. They were the golden youth of the USSR. Strong, intellectual, and incredibly fit. This was a grade 3 hike, the highest difficulty rating in the Soviet Union. This wasn't a walk in the park. This was a certification run for the masters. January 23rd. We're on the train. Everyone is singing. Rustam is playing the mandolin. I wonder what awaits us in the north? It feels like a grand adventure is beginning. Look at their faces. They had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, every person in that picture would be dead. The group arrived at the desolate outpost of Vizhai on January 25th. This was the last stop of civilization. Beyond this point, only snow, wolves, and the indigenous Mansi people. But here, fate intervened. There was a 10th hiker, Yuri Yudin. Just as the trek began, Yudin's chronic back pain flared up. He couldn't carry his pack. He had to turn back. Imagine that moment. The hugs. The jokes. Save some vodka for us. Yuri Yudin turned around and walked back to the village. He was angry at his bad luck. He didn't know that his bad luck was the only reason he would live to see old age. The remaining 9 pushed forward. For the next few days, their diaries describe a brutal but happy routine. They skied along frozen rivers. They battled deep snow. They shared tents and teased each other about romance. But as they moved deeper into the Mansi territory, the landscape began to change. The trees got smaller. The wind got louder. They were approaching the foothills of the Otorten mountain. In the local Mansi language, Otorten translates roughly to "don't go there." A warning? Or just a name? February 1st. The day everything changed. Based on the recovered diaries and the film found in their cameras, we know exactly what happened. They started late. They got tired. Instead of going down into the valley where the forest would protect them from the wind, Dyatlov made a controversial decision. He decided to set up camp right there. On the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. What? Maybe he didn't want to lose the altitude they had gained. Maybe he was confident in his team. They leveled the snow. They pitched the tent. They ate a cold dinner of crackers and ham because they couldn't build a fire on the open slope. This is the moment frozen in time. They look calm. They are undressing for bed. They are taking off their wet boots. At around 6 p.m. they settled in for the night. Jokes were cracked. Everything was normal. Until something happened. We don't know the exact time. But sometime in the darkness, chaos erupted. Imagine waking up in a sleeping bag. Pitch black. And suddenly a force, a sound, a pressure, a fear, so overwhelming that you don't even unzip the tent. You grab your knife. You slash the canvas. and you run into the freezing death waiting outside. To understand why this case has haunted investigators for over 60 years, we cannot just look at the overview. We must look at the bodies. We must look at the specific, impossible details that the rescuers found when they arrived at the pass on February 26. The search party, a mix of fellow students and military personnel, first spotted the tent. It was half collapsed, covered in snow. But what froze their blood wasn't the tent itself, it was the slash marks. The canvas had been cut from the inside. Not in panic, but with deliberate, vertical strokes. These were large cuts, big enough for a human to squeeze through. Why cut your only shelter open in a blizzard? Why not untie the entrance? Unless the entrance was blocked? Or unless the danger was inside with you. Following the footprints leading away from the tent, the searchers descended toward the tree line about a mile downslope. Section: The Cedar Tree and the First Three. Narrator: Here, under a towering Siberian cedar, they found the remains of a small fire. And next to it, the first two bodies, Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were frozen solid. But their condition was baffling. They were stripped to their underwear. No shoes. No gloves. Just thin shirts and underpants in temperatures that would freeze water instantly. But the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing. The skin on their palms and fingers was torn off. Fragments of their skin were found embedded in the bark of the cedar tree, up to 5 meters high. They hadn't just been sitting by the fire. They had been climbing. Desperately. Frantically. Were they climbing to break off branches for the fire? Or were they climbing to look back at the tent, to see if the thing that chased them was still there? Searchers then found 3 more bodies, Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kalmogorova and Rustam Slobodin, scattered in a line between the cedar tree and the tent. Their positioning told a heartbreaking story. They weren't running away. They were crawling back. Dyatlov was found clutching a small birch branch, his face buried in the snow, as if protecting himself from a driving wind. Zina had traveled the furthest back up the slope, her body frozen in a posture of sheer determination. Rustam had a minor crack in his skull, likely from a fall, but not enough to kill him. The medical examiner determined that all 5 had died of hypothermia. Their bodies were stiff, their skin discolored by the cold. It was tragic, but medically speaking it made sense. The case seemed ready to close. But 4 hikers were still missing. It would take the spring thaw, 3 months later, to reveal the true horror of Dyatlov Pass. In May, deep in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, searchers found the remaining 4. Ludmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles and Alexander Kolevatov. They were buried under 13 feet of hard-packed snow. And unlike the others, they hadn't just frozen to death. They had been brutalized. When the medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, performed the autopsies, he was stunned. Nikolai's skull was crushed. The fracture was so severe that bone fragments had been driven into his brain. Semyon and Ludmila had multiple broken ribs. Semyon's chest was flail, 5 ribs broken on the right side. Ludmila's was even worse, 10 broken ribs piercing her heart and lungs. Dr. Vozrozdeny wrote in his official report that the force required to cause such damage was equal to that of a car crash moving at high speed. It was a force of immense pressure. But here is the detail that defies logic. There were no external bruises. If a bear had attacked them, there would be claw marks. If a rockfall had hit them, the skin would be lacerated. But their skin was unbroken. It was as if they had been squeezed to death by a giant, invisible hand. And then, the most grotesque discovery of all. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. She was missing her eyes. The tissue around her mouth had been stripped away to the bone. Semyon was also missing his eyes. The Soviet authorities panicked. They ordered radiological testing on the clothes. The Geiger counters clicked. Beta radiation was found on the sweaters of 2 of the hikers. Radiation. Crushed bones. Missing organs. A tent slashed from the inside. The authorities abruptly closed the investigation on May 28, 1959. The official cause of death? A compelling natural force. The files were sent to a secret archive. The area was closed to the public for 3 years. The parents of the deceased were told to stop asking questions. But silence only feeds the fire of curiosity. For decades, in the absence of truth, the world created myths. Theory 1: The Mansi Attack. Investigators initially suspected the indigenous Mansi people, who considered the mountain sacred. Perhaps the hikers had trespassed? The KGB interrogated local Mansi hunters aggressively. But the theory collapsed. The slash marks on the tent were from the inside. There were no other footprints in the snow, no sign of a struggle, no hand-to-hand combat. The Mansi were cleared. Theory 2, the KGB and the orange spheres. This is the most persistent theory. On the night of the incident, another group of hikers camping 30 miles south reported seeing strange glowing orange spheres moving across the night sky in the direction of Kholat-Syakhl. Was this a secret military test? A failed missile launch that exploded mid-air? Proponents of this theory argue that the force that crushed their ribs was the shockwave of an explosion. The radiation on their clothes? Fallout from the weapon. The missing eyes? Scavenged by birds, or dissolved by chemical agents. It fits the Cold War paranoia. But there was no crater. No scorch marks on the trees. No shrapnel. Theory 3, the infrasound madness. Science offers a stranger possibility, the Kármán vortex street. This phenomenon occurs when wind hits a dome-shaped mountain at a specific angle, creating a series of small tornadoes. These vortices can generate infrasound, a low-frequency hum below the range of human hearing. Studies have shown that infrasound can cause feelings of dread, nausea, and extreme panic in humans. Did the wind literally drive them insane? Did they feel an overwhelming urge to flee the tent because their own brains were vibrating with fear? It explains the escape. It explains the lack of external attackers. But it does not explain the crushed ribs. Infrasound cannot break bones. It took 62 years and technology from Hollywood to finally crack the case. In 2021, Johann Gaum, a snow avalanche simulation expert in Switzerland, teamed up with Alexander Puzrin. They were inspired by the snow animation technology used in the Disney movie Frozen. They fed the topographical data of Kholat-Syakhl into their simulation. And they found the missing piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a missile. It was a slab avalanche. But not a normal avalanche. This was a rare, delayed, and silent killer. Here is the science of what happened. When the group cut into the slope to pitch their tent, they weakened the structural integrity of the snowpack. But the slope wasn't steep enough for a typical avalanche, so nothing happened immediately. They went to sleep. But that night, the katabatic winds, heavy, cold winds flowing down the mountain, deposited more snow onto the slope above the tent. Slowly. Weight upon weight. At some point in the darkness, a crack formed. A rigid block of ice, heavy as a concrete slab, detached. It didn't roar down the mountain. Simply a slit. Just a few feet. Slam. It hit the tent while they were sleeping. This explains everything. The car crash injuries? That was the sheer weight of tons of hard snow crushing Ludmila and Semyon against the hard ground, breaking their ribs instantly. But because it was pressure, not impact, there were no bruises. The tent collapsed. They were trapped in the dark, suffocating under the weight. Igor cut the canvas to get them out. They dragged their injured friends into the storm. They knew avalanches come in waves. They couldn't stay. They couldn't dig for their boots. They had to get to the tree line. We can now reconstruct their final, heroic hours. They reached the cedar tree. They tried to build a fire. But the injured were dying. In a desperate attempt to keep the others warm, they made the ultimate sacrifice. They took the clothes off the bodies of the first two who died, the two Yuris, to wrap around the injured hikers. This explains the undressing. It wasn't madness. It was survival. The group split up. Dyatlov and two others tried to crawl back to the tent to get the medical kit. They froze on the slope. The others, carrying the critically injured Ludmila and Semyon, tried to build a snow den in the ravine to escape the wind. But the snow collapsed on them again, burying them under 13 feet of ice. And the missing eyes and tongue? Dr. Vozrozdeny's report mentions the presence of a stream under the snow in the ravine. Ludmila lay face down in that running water for 3 months. The soft tissue decomposition was natural. Disturbing but natural. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass was never about monsters or aliens. It was a tragedy of timing. A few degrees of slope. A shift in the wind. A decision to camp in the wrong spot. But looking back at this story, we shouldn't see just victims. We should see bravery. Even with crushed chests, even in the pitch black, even as they froze to death, they never abandoned each other. They cut clothes from the dead to save the living. They carried their wounded friends until they literally could not take another step. The files are closed. The science is settled. But the legend of the Dyatlov group remains, a chilling reminder of how small we are in the face of nature's indifference.